All right, so basically there are three different questions you've posed. So we'll start with the first one, which was kind of, if my opponent's sword is low and to the right, and this here is my opponent's sword, it's as low and to the right as I'm going to get it, and still have it be in screen. But really, if it's anywhere down here in this bottom quadrant and not pointed at me, the solution is the same. So yeah, your first video was, how do you deal with that? And you had an empty hand, because there are two different solutions here. So if you have an empty hand, you only have your sword. Their sword is over there. Again, down in this lower left quadrant, out of presence, pointed at the ground, pointed at wherever, doesn't really matter. Remember that it has to come into presence, right? To be able to hit you, it has to come into presence. And we'll talk about the one way that's not true, but basic working premise here, it has to come into presence, which means wherever the hell it is down there, it has to come to here. This area right in here, right? It can be pointed off to that side there, but it has to come, point at me, point at my chest, point at my stomach. And it's down low, so we can expect that it'll probably come down. It'll probably be a low shot. But really what this is a trap. It's baiting your sword out of position. It's baiting you into throwing at an opening. It's baiting you into doing something so that they can take that tempo and hit you. So, and I think in this I'll start to add in how things change as measure changes. So start out here, outside of measure. I'm going to cover that sword the same way I would cover any sword on the inside line. I'm going to point at my opponent's left shoulder. I'm not sure how easily or how much of that difference you can see with this camera setup, but it's going from here to here. I'm pointing at my opponent's left shoulder. Because again, their sword still has to come into presence. It has to come into this area. Even if it's out of presence right now, it has to come into presence to be a threat. So here we are, we're outside of measure. I point at my opponent's left shoulder. I, Wistric, take this guard a lot. I point my sword down and to the right, and I sit here with, like, doing my lazy Wistric thing, and my big old, come on, try to hit me opening. Just setting up one of two shots. One is that sort of quarter with the lunge offline, the other is the disengage and hit. If I'm sitting here doing this, and my opponent covers my sword correctly. So if my opponent does this much, boom, just moves from pointing at my right shoulder to my left shoulder, or from my left shoulder to my right shoulder. Sorry, I'm seeing a mirror right now. Goes from pointing at my offside shoulder to my sword shoulder. This forces, if my opponent does that, points at my sword shoulder while I'm down here, I get fewer options immediately, and I start considering changing my tactics. This isn't a hypothetical opponent, this is Wistric. If my opponent just closes that inside line here, even though my sword's nowhere near presence, I consider how I'm going to, I have to start thinking a couple of levels deeper. If my opponent overcloses to here, they've really just done what I wanted them to do. The whole point of that out of presence sword position is to pull my sword out of position trying to cover it. And you see my sword point goes from, pointed at you to, my sword's no longer in presence. It's not doing any good for me. And yeah, you can't come through my guard, But now I'm wide open over here. And that's a thing that you used to do. You used to sort of overbind, over-engage on the inside line and open yourself up to being hit. Brendan used to do it, still does it sometimes. But, you know, you see that sword just come across like, oh, I've got to cover that sword way out here. And suddenly everything's open to just a straight cavazione into the shot. So don't do that. Don't do that at your initial setup. If my opponent takes that guard, I'm going to take my counter guard. And it's going to be the same counter guard I would take against any sword on the inside line. Below my nipples, really. If there's swords down there, my sword's here. If there's swords over that way, my sword's here. If there's swords right here, my sword's here. And that's my counter guard. That's my starting counter guard. So now we talk about how that changes the measure. And tactically. So I've taken my counter guard, right? I know, I'm safe. I'm safe from an inside line attack. Their first option is to try to cavazione and come in over my arm. So my first thing that I'm looking out for them to do is start moving that sword for a cavazione. In which case, I'll basically just counter extend into it. There's no over my arm left, and my sword's in their face, and I've won. But again, I can only do that if my sword is here. If my sword's here, I can't make that motion quickly enough to get a stop thrust into their cavazione. Yeah, so let's say, you know, they've taken their guard, I've taken my counter guard, we're staying here at measure. The other option they have is a big offline lunge to try to come around my sword. If I was performing that, it would be this action, right? Like imagine my opponent's sword is here, I'm throwing around it, trying to avoid out of the way, and throw a shot up into their chest or stomach. That is the other way to get around the sword. You can cavazione around the sword. And we've talked about how, you know, when they go for that cavazione to the high shoulder, to the sword shoulder on the high outside line, my counter is small and absolute. So what if they take that big offline lunge, which is a yield? If they take a yield instead of a cavazione. It's a much larger action, so you have more time to read it coming. It doesn't start with the motion of the tip dropping, right? Like my sword doesn't. If I'm taking that big action, my sword tip barely moves. So if I'm looking at my opponent and their sword doesn't, and I know I'm contradicting the thing where all I have to do is look to see if my opponent's moving. If my opponent's sword isn't moving, really, then I know that they're not doing a cavazione. So then, are their feet moving? If their feet are moving, if their weight's shifting that direction, I know they're about to do a big offline lunge that way, and I know that's where they're going to go. Now, they're taking their big action to try to get around my sword, try to do that yield, try to do that offline lunge. And again, I've just fought my little, like, hey, the way I forced them into that was by going from pointing at their left shoulder to their right shoulder. They have to do some lunge to get around my sword now, or they have to do a cavazione. I know how to stop. You know how to stop thrust the cavazione, or you know how to counter thrust into the cavazione to shut it out. Their other option is try to get around your sword this way. Here is where you have forced them to take a big action. Now you have time to do the big action of your choice in response. So they are coming around this way. Their head's going to be right about here. So all I have to do is make sure that my sword gets there, and my body is nowhere near where it is right now. Well, you know, there's a way you love to do that, right? Boom! My sword is now in the space where their head should be. My body, you know, was over here, and their sword is going for that spot. It's not there anymore. In fact, their sword is now coming in parallel to my sword. So I've fairly closed the line against them trying to redirect their yield into yet another attack into me. Any sort of offline action, you know, just an offline lunge this way will clear your body out of that way. That's cancel to Pia Drito, that's cancel to the right foot. So, might do. It's not going to be the one that's going to make me feel really safe, but it might do the trick. But also notice that I am allowing my arm to come across now, right? In normal, if we were just keeping everything in here in presence, I wouldn't. But they're taking a big step out of presence. They're moving their body out of presence. I need to bring my sword back in presence as I take whatever counter offline action I'm taking. And if you think, I see them start to shift their body that way, they're not doing a cavazione, their body starts going that way, I know exactly what's coming, I know exactly where they're going, and this is a pretty quick response. And fairly safe. It's that more the Agrippa Pia Drito with the actual step of the right foot, not just the twist. This is a little fancier, but it's also still faster than me trying to go wham and throw that big lunge. There's a really good chance you're getting out of that. So there's just no reason. So those are your counters. Close the line. Just close the line. Don't try to like actually bind their sword. Just close the line so that they have to find a different line. And they have two options. One is to cavazione into the outside line, and the other is to yield. And you counter the cavazione the way you usually would, and you counter them taking a big offline step and opening themselves by stabbing them and moving your body out of the way. That's out here. Now, say they've taken they're out of presence guard. They're baiting you into attacking. And say you want to force the issue. You take that step into measure. Now, it's a lot easier for them to throw a little angled shot up into here. So now I'm going to commit to that bind a bit more. But I'm going to lead, I'm going to commit to that find a bit more, because I'm now going to be in measure. But I'm going to lead with my sword. I'm not going to lead with the step. If I lead with the step, I'm still wide open. They get that time that my foot's in the air to throw their shot. If I lead with my sword, I've deprived them of that shot. They still have, their options are still to throw either a disengage out here, and the target area is a little bigger, but because I'm closer in and my sword's in the way, they have to take a larger motion to get to it, or to throw that yielding attack. So, stepping into measure, I lead with my sword. They'll probably retreat. Wistric, fighting lazy guard, will retreat. It's what it's just easier for me than trying to get fancy. I'd rather just stand back here and try to throw big shots from distance. Say you want to force things. Say you're going into an attack proceeding with resolution. So you just take that starting action. They have their disengage. If that sword starts moving, you can still counter thrust from here. If they start moving offline, well, you're in measure, just hit them. Like, just, if they're about to try to throw an angled shot, now they have to take a big action to get around your sword. they're going to put their head right there and just stab it. But really, if you're taking this step, just proceeding with resolution. So taking that advance into measure, led by the sword, if you just continue proceeding with resolution there. So the passing step that brings you forward. You are now safe from that yielding shot. My sword is exactly where their head will be. They have no disengage here. And I've covered everything and they're dead. So that's the first video.